This series is designed to coincide with a number of projects that we've been running. One, our AHRC Cares for the Future project on screening European heritage, that we've had a series of events this year. And Alan's project on Italian cinema's Italian histories, which is kind of, I guess, a project that's increasing in momentum. It seems to me, certainly we're looking at it from the outside, he's kind of had a series of events and it's kind of ongoing, both of which have got, I would say, very vibrant blogs, and we would encourage you to have a look at them and like us in various fora. But within that context, I am very, very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Robert Burgoyne from the University of St Andrews. Robert is the chair of film studies there, and I'm sure, as everybody knows in this room, his work centres on historical representation of film, with a particular emphasis on questions of memory and emotion. Currently, he's working on the representation of war, in film and photography. His recent publications include Generational Memory and Affect in 2 letters from Iwo Jima, and Abstraction and Embodiments in the War Film, the Hollywood Historical Film, as well as Filmation, Hollywood Looks at US History, which is now in its revised 2nd edition, I believe. Robert's paper today on Somatic War. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. This is very nice to be invited. Thank you for the people who invited me, and thank you for coming. It's given me a chance to put something almost brand new together. There are pieces that have been published before, but this is a new frame for those pieces, and there's a substantial chunk of brand. The figure of the body in narratives of war has long served to crystallize ideas about collective violence and the value or futility of sacrifice, often functioning as a symbol of historical transformation and renewal, or contrastingly as a sign of utter degeneration and waste. As a number of recent studies have shown, the power of somatic imagery to shape cultural perceptions of war has had a decisive impact on the way wars have been regarded in history, and has sometimes influenced the conduct of war as it unfolds. In the current period, however, a competing paradigm of war representation has emerged, most often defined as war at a distance, characterized by an emphasis on remote targeting, automated weaponry, and digital mediation, suggesting a new optic and a new cultural framing of war. A recent museum exhibition by Harun Farooqi, for example, depicts the pervasive role of digital media in the training of U.S. soldiers for war, in the selection of targets, and in the actual conduct of war. An exhibition that illustrates what might be called the military dream of bodiless war, described by some writers, apparently without irony, as hygienic and virtuous. Here, the body of the soldier or the civilian in war, the felt experience of violence and the emotional intensity of conflict is all but bracketed from the scene. Depicting an almost decorporealized experience, Farooqi's exhibition suggests an optic of war that is radically different from the imagery of embodied violence that has defined war representation throughout the past century. The tension between these two cultural framings of war in the 21st century, between a vision of bodiless or post-heroic warfare and a concept of war as an extreme form of embodied experience, one whose representation creates a public sphere of witnessing, is captured in the divergent genre signals of the contemporary war film. In this talk, I analyze several recent films that foreground the body at risk and contrast these films with depictions of war as a battle of the screens, working against the imagery of war at a distance that dominates the discourse of Western war theorists. The works I treat in this presentation are centered on the depiction of somatic experience, emphasizing the body in war as a privileged representational site and underlining its role as a vehicle of emotion and a catalyst for critical debate. In concentrating on images of embodied violence, I wish to address a surprising gap in the film studies literature. Although scenes of somatic violence and images of the violated body have shaped the genre from its inception, from D.W. Griffith's battlefield tableau to Catherine Bigelow's personalized scenes of violent infliction, the cultural importance of embodied violence, its symbolic weight, and the stark challenge it presents to ethical authorship and spectatorship has not been explored. In this talk, I place the subject of embodied violence in relief. In the three films I discuss here, Paradise Now, The Hurt Locker, and Zero Dark 30, the embodied experience of war is the main narrative driver as well as the symbolic center of the text, the key to the film's visual grammar, and the vehicle of a particularly complex affective logic. The influential work of Linda Williams on body genres in film, a study that inaugurated a new interest in the somatic response that certain types of film elicit, provides one of the theoretical supports for this study. Williams famously itemized the genres of horror, melodrama, and pornography as forms that trigger a physiological response in the viewer. The shivering and adrenalized fear that accompanies horror, the tears that are elicited by melodrama, and the physical arousal that pornography is dedicated to providing. Surprisingly, however, the idea of the war film as a body genre has not been explored. Although the war film's signature scenes of intense visceral imagery and spectacular violence produce an array of somatic responses, including fear, shock, violent outrage, and adrenalized excitement, the question of the affective logic of the war film has been all but ignored in contemporary film studies. In this talk, I'll attempt to fill this gap, suggesting ways in which the war film might be understood as a particularly complex form of body genre, and showing how the somatic response of the spectator may be considered central to the aesthetic and the thematic purposes of the film. Paradise Now, The Hurt Locker, and Zero Dark 30 represent, in my view, a striking intensification of one of the central themes of war cinema, the body at risk. Expanding the vocabulary of war representation beyond the frame of traditional historical and national meta-narratives, each of these films seems to challenge the spectator to insist that we force meaning from embodied experience. In each, violence and conflict in war is performed, experienced, and perceived through bodily frames of cinematic representation. I'm going to start now with Paradise Now. Paradise Now follows the last 3 days in the life of a suicide bomber in the West Bank, depicting the transformation of the main character, a shy young man living in the shadow of a complicated family history, into a ritualized sacrificial subject, an imagined agent of national redemption. The film offers a nuanced treatment of an extreme manifestation of the shifting character of war in the present, the use of the body as a weapon. In recent years, suicide as a tactic of war has become an emblematic and terrifying weapon of contemporary geopolitical conflict, confirming the perverse potency of the body in the theater of combat. At a point when technology seems ubiquitous and overwhelming, the power of bodies in war has suddenly returned in the form of an agency whose traumatizing impact reverberates throughout the contemporary world. Understood by theorists such as Machiavelli and Clausewitz as the most important weapon of war, the body of the committed partisan seems to have freakishly metamorphosed into the figure of the human bomb in some sectors, a figure who is celebrated, like the partisans of the past, in areas of the society in which he or she lived, and demonized in the cultures under attack. Although the extensive literature on the symbolism of martyrdom, sacrifice, and the human bomb in contemporary Palestine can't be summarized here, the scholarly works on the subject describe a complex sociological phenomenon in which religious, political, and military ideas and purposes are combined in an act of spectacular violence. What emerges as central in these readings is that the act is deeply embedded in society. As Ivan Strensky writes, while these deaths seem to be calculated utilitarian acts of individuals, they are exemplary signs that are intended for certain audiences. Their success seems necessarily to rely upon the kind of communal recognition and subsequent ritual celebration of the operations by the community from which the bomber comes. These ideas are expressed in the videotaping of the Martyr Speeches by the two main characters of Paradise Now, Saeed and Khaled, and in the ritual that surrounds the preparation for martyrdom. Paradise Now centers on the body, editing it into different symbolic systems, transforming it into a figural expression of the history and the imagined community of Palestine. The imagined power of violence to remake history and the individual is emphasized here. Despite the break in form caused by the camera that didn't work, the Martyr Speeches convey a chilling seriousness. Khaled and Saeed are both portrayed wielding rifles, dressed in fatigues, and wearing ammo belts and headbands, as the camera, framing them in a frontal-centered shot, slowly tracks into close-up. The visual grammar of the scene is significant, in striking contrast with the concealment and passing that is critical to the success of the human bomber, who must blend in with the social scene he is targeting and pass anonymously within the target society. The visibility of the performance is emphasized in the Martyr videos. While the human bomber will be clothed in innocuous garb during the mission, and his or her weapon will be hidden from view, the video celebrates and even exaggerates the visibility of the threat. The almost atavistic image of the resistance fighter presented here brings to mind Jean Baudrillard's description of the terror attack. The terrorist suicide, he writes, is personal, carried out in broad daylight. Quote, everything resides in the defiance and the duel, in a dual, personal relationship with the adverse power. Since it is the one that humiliates, it is the one that must be humiliated, and not simply exterminated. It must be made to lose face. The other must be targeted and hurt in the full light of the adversarial struggle, end quote. Baudrillard emphasizes the actions of the human bomber as a kind of secular combat in open, contested space. But the religious meaning of sacrifice is also important here. In the Martyr Ritual, the bodies of the characters are transformed from what Gilles Deleuze calls the quotidian body into the ceremonial body. Along with the filming and the narrating of the Martyr Speech, the film details the careful washing of the characters' bodies, the shaving, and the close haircut, all rendered in a slow montage accompanied by the sound of prayers. Accenting the ceremonial transformation of the body, the closing shot of this sequence depicts the two lead characters seated at a long table, framed in a way that recalls Leonardo's The Last Supper. The connotations of sacrifice and the body are emphasized here in a way that is simultaneously religious, national, and cross-cultural. The scene as a whole depicts the Martyr Ritual in a style that creates aesthetic beauty out of a history of violence. Its aesthetic potency, the slow, gliding movement of the camera, the chanting that functions like music, the sensual lighting, depends on our awareness of the material off stage, out of frame, the carnage, abjection, and pain of suicide bombing, and the larger context of Palestinian history in the 20th and 21st centuries. The referential world of real loss and waste is here enchanted into art. Using a film language associated with enchantment, the scene illustrates the way the body is converted through ritual into a site of magical transformation. The real-world pain and agony of war, the violence of the act of self-sacrifice, is here concealed in a social ritual whose transformative magic seems to ennoble the act. Avoiding any direct reference to the violence that will be inflicted on the body and on other bodies, the scene conveys a sense of purpose and a certain beauty. At the same time, however, Paradise Now threads small, corporeal reminders into the texture of the sequence. The shot of the bomb maker whose hands have been blown off, for example, and Khaled's message to his mother in conversational Arabic about where to buy the best water filters as the assembled men eat the sandwiches his mother prepared for him. These details form a subtle counterpoint to the aestheticizing Martyr Ritual. Side by side with the ceremonial presentation of self-sacrifice, the film presents a specific, brutal reminder of the physical pain of war, crystallized in the shot of the stumps and hooks of the bomb maker as he solders together the explosive leads on the suicide vest. While the film stops short of providing a fully articulated alternative to the concept of sacrificial violence, its second act stages several scenes that register as a protest against suicide bombing. As Saeed wanders around Nablus in the second half of the film, dressed in his dark suit with the explosive vest locked onto his body, he has a series of encounters, first with his mother, whom he decides not to see, then with Suha, his would-be girlfriend, with whom he shares a first kiss, and with the proprietor of a video store, where he learns that martyr videos are far less popular than collaborator confession videos. In these ordinary encounters, the body of the martyr becomes once again quotidian. Sweating profusely, aware that he is a menace to his own village and to his friends, Saeed confronts himself in the mirror and says, "If the perpetrators paint themselves as victims, then I have no choice but to become a victim too, and a murderer as well." End quote. In the last shot of the film, the camera finds Saeed on an Israeli bus, populated mainly with young soldiers, male and female, and begins a slow, inexorable track to his face. Using the same visual technique as was used during the martyr videos, the camera here emphasizes not the communal, transformative potential of sacrifice, but the isolation of a deeply pathological act. What had started as a collective quest, an aggressive assertion of collective will, a push into history, concludes in solitude, as Saeed is portrayed in an extreme, isolating close-up, the camera closing in to reveal only the character's eyes as he makes his decision whether or not to consummate the act. Now going to switch gears just a bit to The Hurt Locker, which is a film I'm certain you've all seen and probably seen a few times. A very different bodily frame of reference and bodily frame of experience is invoked in The Hurt Locker. Beginning with a line from the author Chris Hedges, "The rush of battle is often a potent and lethal addiction, for war is a drug." From his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, The Hurt Locker immediately conveys a picture of war that would have been unimaginable in the war films of the 20th century. Framing combat as an addictive pleasure, an ongoing private and collective need, the film departs radically from genre convention, disdaining the formulas of older war films for a mode of address that emphasizes the adrenalized experience of risk. Although traces of this theme can be found in earlier war films such as Patton and Apocalypse Now, The Hurt Locker foregrounds the idea of private pleasure and experience in war, rendering war as a somatic engagement that seems to take place outside any larger meta-narrative of history or nation. While the irregular fighter of the Palestinian resistance, embodied in the character of Saeed in Paradise Now, can be partially mapped as the flawed protagonist of history, a distorted emblem of frustrated national emergence, the figure of the combat soldier in The Hurt Locker seems to be divorced from any national or social meta-narrative. Instead, a mood of pure, visceral excitement prevails. In the figure of Sergeant William James, the anxiety of entering a no-man's land of risk is matched by the exhilaration of locating the hidden triggers, finding the secret connections, living life in a threshold state where discovery and revelation are instantly counterpointed by the threat of annihilation. Foregrounding the experience the importance of private experience and pleasure in war, the almost erotic charge of defusing the bombs, the film appears to underline the meaning that war gives as a form of intense bodily excitement, personalized, in which the palpable experience of risk, of the body at risk, is separated from any kind of larger national project. One writer has described war as an embodied medium of imagination and experience. In the Hurt Locker's portrayal of combat in the 21st century, sense impressions dominate. The amplified heartbeat, the quickened breathing, the labor of motion, the slipperiness of blood. The portfolio of bodily experience indexed in the film centers on the sensory modalities of risk and threat, extending from the dreamlike, ponderous movements of Thompson, encased in his Kevlar bomb suit in the opening scene, unable to run fast enough to escape the blast that he knows is imminent, to the near panic of the EOD team members as they fail to sight potential triggermen embedded in the urban milieu, to the visual confrontation with atrocity that James experiences in the middle portion of the film. Much of this opening sequence valorizes the excitement of warfare in an urban space, as the adrenalized montage portrays the new battle zone as a space of adventure and risk. Along with the sonic layering of the sounds of the city and the shouts and wisecracks of the soldiers, the optics of multiple cameras translate the kinesthetic impressions of combat into powerful contrasts of speed and delay, movement and pause. Pure visual style recodes the violence of the scene into an almost exhilarating experience. A very different tone emerges, however, in the slow-motion rendering of the death of Thompson, as the body of the soldier is flung nearly into the lap of the spectator. Placed before our gaze and held in place for a long suspended moment, the body of the soldier is depicted in a way that insists that it be recognized. Death carries radical authority, and in this close, slow-motion shot, its power is placed in relief. The Hurt Locker conveys an almost anthropological interest in the ways violence is performed and experienced, repeatedly exploring what one writer calls the edge work of the modern soldier, the threshold states of physical risk. In the film's three major sequences of violent encounter, the living body encased in Kevlar armor, the corpse turned into a bomb, and the body locked into a suicide vest, we view a new cinematic iteration of the body at risk. Sergeant William James, who has joined the EOD team as its new leader after the killing of Thompson, embodies the idea of edgework in the contemporary war film. Although several commentators have compared James to Captain Willard in Apocalypse Now, the differences between the two characters are more striking. Willard in Apocalypse Now is an observer of the action, quietly watching and commenting as the events of the plot unfold, continuously grafting us into his thoughts and his memories. James, by contrast, is defined not by interior monologue or psychologically expressive reaction shots, but by the actions he performs alone. Disdaining the use of the bot, removing the bomb suit helmet at the first opportunity, and disappearing behind a smoke screen in order to conduct his work alone, James seems to be seeking out a threshold or border. Where Willard in Apocalypse Now is defined by Kurtz as a grocery clerk come to collect the bill, James is driven mainly by the private pleasure of excitement and fear, of living in a threshold state. This threshold state is powerfully visualized in the film's body bomb sequence. Here, the body as a weapon takes on an explicitly melodramatic and horrific turn. The film's exorbitant manipulation of emotion in this sequence pushes into an emotional range usually reserved for horror. Almost exploitative in its unrelenting depiction of body horror in the context of war, the scene seems close to the emotional hyperbole of Grand Guignol, arousing the spectator to a feeling of outrage. As with other key moments in the film, it centers on the complex emotions and meanings associated with the body in war, The shots of the teenage Iraqi boy who called himself Beckham, laid out on a table and covered in blood, his abdomen sliced open and a bomb planted inside, brings into relief the themes of disenchantment and enchantment that circulate around the body in filmic treatments of war. Elaine Scarry describes the injured open body in war, and the imagery of blood in particular, as a privileged way of translating violence into meaning. She writes that the power of war representation depends on the, quote, mining of the ultimate substance, the ultimate source of substantiation, the extraction of the physical basis or reality from its dark hiding place in the body out into the light of day, end quote. In war representation, she writes, it is the power of the body, and especially its displayed interior, that holds the key for constructing expressive meaning. Here, however, the depiction of the violated body of Beckham is a figure of atrocity with a difference. The victim is now also a weapon. The victim of terror has become the medium of terror, the body turned into a bomb. James's rescue of Beckham's body can easily be read as an ideologically loaded manipulation of audience emotion, depicting grotesque body trauma in order to make a flagrant political point about the villainy of the insurgency in Iraq and the self-sacrificial willingness to risk all by the American soldier. From this angle, the film appears to revert to the propagandistic stereotypes of an earlier period, rendering an act of diabolical cruelty in a way that arouses an intense and highly directed emotional response. Rather than creating an immediate sense of disenchantment, of simple disgust, the film's image of the opened, injured body arouses an intense feeling of outrage, moving the spectator, in Sergei Eisenstein's words, and works directly on the somatic, emotional response of the viewer. In the slowed tempo, focused imagery, and in the closely pictured figure behavior of James, however, a secondary tone emerges. As James dismantles the bomb inside Beckham's abdomen, the act puts into a single frame the imagery of bomb defusing with its wires, leads, and secret triggers, and the imagery of surgery, the manipulation of organs, vessels, and flesh. James's delicate and intricate work, his skill with his hands, takes on a new meaning as the almost tender act of working on Beckham's body brings into relief the restorative act of preserving the body from further harm. Filmed in extreme close-up, the soundtrack dominated by James's breathing, the sequence culminates in his lifting of the explosive from Beckham's abdomen. He then wraps the body in a white sheet and carries it from the building. Violence is not re-enchanted here. The body of Beckham is not seen as generative or as a site of magical transformation. But nor is the body seen only as a symbol of war's degeneracy and waste. The sequence is effective precisely because of the intertwining of the imagery of disenchantment and enchantment, whose interconnection is especially apparent, as Scarry reminds us, when it comes to the magic fluid of blood. The doubleness that is inscribed in the sequence, the condensation of the imagery of atrocity and the imagery of rescue, brings the close alignment of enchantment and disenchantment in war cinema directly into view. Poised somewhere between accusing and renewing the nation's bond to war, the film exposes the image of the violated body to the full range of emotion that it calls up, insisting again on the radical authority of the body in war. In the doubled meaning of the body of Beckham, the victim of terror become a weapon of terror, the film creates a metaphor and a kind of physiological object lesson in the power of war, its pointlessness and barbarism, but above all, its self-reinforcing nature. The cycle of violence, of revenge, that war engenders is crystallized somatically, mimetically experienced by the spectator in the deep emotional response of violent outrage, triggered by the image of Beckham's body in a scene that is as distant from the dream of bodiless war as can be imagined. Sorry there's not more fun to be had in this presentation. And I'm afraid I'm going to continue with the tough sequences. I'm now going to talk for a little bit, finishing up here on Zero Dark 30. In Zero Dark 30, conflict and violence are explored from a somatic frame that is at once intimate and inseparable from the large-scale violence that dominates the short history of the young century. In the course of the film, violence is rendered in immediate close-up, both acoustic and visual, and gradually dilated to read as a defining historical motif, an organizing cultural and aesthetic fact, rendering the concrete terror of 9/11 in an acoustic montage followed by a brutal portrayal of interrogation and torture. Zero Dark 30 explores the specific contours of what might be called a new violent imaginary, shaped by endless threat, by the constant possibility of attack, and by the willingness to use force as a default response. At the film's center, the character Maya registers the experience of violence as a direct, intimate witnessing, a witnessing that sutures her to the larger social and historical world the film portrays. In her single-minded focus on the pursuit of Osama bin Laden, a picture of a world emerges, a world defined by hidden networks of potential threats that may or may not be real, underlined by scenes of visceral injury, death, and violent confrontation, conveyed in the aesthetic language of the procedural, a form that proliferates its own forms of anxiety. The violence in the film is thus both explicit and implied, experienced intimately, physically, and spread over a vast network of surveillance and tracking data, with each data point, terrorist photograph, and intercepted communication mapping both a history and a subjective script of violence and potential attack. Evoking the events of 9/11 on a black screen with sounds of radio transmissions serving as a sonic shorthand, the film frames its depiction of 9/11 in a way that penetrates the veil of familiarity that has formed around the events of that day. As an aesthetic device, sound slides under the psychic censorship that regularly attends visual representation. Unlike vision, one cannot look away from sound or easily close one's ears, nor is sound rationalized or contained as readily as visual representation. Here, the sounds of 9/11 serve to call up the emotional meaning of the events, giving them a personal focus, providing a direct portrayal of the experience of the victims, and placing the body once more at the center of an event that had grown encrusted with visual cliché. The opening scene places the audience in the position of witness, like the emergency dispatcher in the last radio transmission, in a way that both short-circuits the voyeurism often elicited by the imagery of disaster and collapses the distancing that visual representation sometimes allows. In its opening scenes, Zero Dark 30 places the violated body at the center of the film's articulation of history, providing a figuration that haunts the film and shapes the depiction of the main character. In the close-up rendering of torture and interrogation that immediately follows the opening montage, the focal perspective is anchored in the character of Maya, her hands at times covering her eyes, clutching her jacket, and then forcing herself to watch. Maya is foregrounded in the scene's shot patterning. Her experience of torture tracks an arc of emotion and performance that progresses from witnessing to complicity to coercive agency. Beginning with her suggestion that we should go back in, however, the intimate witnessing of violence and torture becomes inseparable from the act itself, a point that is scenically presented in a series of close-ups and eyeline matches between Maya, the lead interrogator, and the torture victim, Amar. The formal patterning of the scene locks the character Maya into an intimate relation with the prisoner, metonymically connecting her to the injured body, not by touch, but by the gaze. It is her gaze that is evoked as the prisoner is later on paraded naked from the waist down and then walked around the room like a dog. It is her gaze that holds the power to humiliate, for whom the scene is staged. And it is her gaze that Dan, the leader of the interrogation, consults before he continues the torture. The surprising thing here, or perhaps it is unsurprising, is the intimacy that flows from the scene. She is connected to the victim in a way that has the paradoxical effect of humanizing him. Rather than creating a distance, a barrier, the injury of the body creates a disturbing join between the characters, a point that comes through strongly when she is alone with him in the cell. Similar in age, their relationship not yet patterned by the grammars of violence that organize the interrogation procedure, the victim asks Maya to help him, to spare him from her partner, who is a madman. As the film unfolds, the interrogation videos that Maya watches over and over spread out on her computer screen in a frightening, Goya-like montage of gasping, shackled men pushes the connection between witnessing and violent infliction to the center of the film's pictorial vocabulary. Studying the interrogations, rewinding and replaying scenes of prisoners shackled to the ceiling, handcuffed to tables, thrown to the floor, or sitting without visible restraint, the character hears or imagines she hears the name Abu Ahmed repeated again and again, a name that sometimes emerges from the questioning and is sometimes supplied by the interrogator. As Maya drills deep into the DVDs, mouthing the words Abu Ahmed when the victims of torture are unable to speak clearly, the name of the courier comes to seem like an uncanny and sinister invocation, drawing her in. Projecting herself fully into this world, Maya's subjectivity, her intuition, and psychology becomes the main focus of the sequence. At one point, she is shown walking into the sunlight from the dark interior of the office, moving slowly and distractedly into bright light, only to return immediately to the violent interrogations unfolding on her computer screen. Finally, she brings up the image of a very young man, framed in close-up, who tells the interrogator that there are many couriers and that no one knows who is directly in contact with bin Laden. His youth, his look of boyish openness, his obvious fear seems to call out for sympathy. Maya's response is ambiguous. In depicting the violated body as the emblematic expression of the war on terror, Zero Dark 30 shapes its imagery, especially in the first third of the film, around the degradation and waste produced by war. Breaching the protected zone that is formed around the war on terror, the film provides an unrelenting treatment of embodied violence, depicting an alternating series of harsh interrogations and devastating terrorist attacks in a kind of expanding, ever-widening loop. The film presents the embodied reality of violence, the intimate experience of constant threat and response as key to the contemporary period, with violence extending over broad geographic zones, penetrating daily life, defining and shaping the actions of the main character, whose certainty of purpose is constructed as the crux of the work. As agent and mirror of violence, however, Maya's gender, youth, and beauty disturb the usual operative models in film. Pre-Raphaelite in her beauty, Maya conveys contradictory messages associated with the violence of contemporary war. The character's youth and sculpted beauty troubles the paradigm of purposive violence. Her striking whiteness, for example, creates a disturbing and dramatic contrast of skin tones and textures during the interrogation scene, producing a visual overtone, an Eisensteinian conflict that is not easily accommodated by genre codes. The violence of war has often generated innovations in aesthetic representation, as the hyperbolic carnage of mass conflict seems to demand aesthetic risk. The innovative poetry and literature of the modernist period, for example, arose partially as a response to the unprecedented mass slaughter of World War I. Similarly, the brooding films of German Expressionism, populated by liminal creatures, were drawn from the spaces and experiences of the Great War. In many ways, Zero Dark 30 fulfills this demand, forging an unsettling, provocative approach to violence, exposing the degeneracy and the brutality of war by emphasizing its effects on the lead character, focusing on the flesh, refusing to idealize or glamorize the war on terror, or to burnish it with patriotic appeal. The film shows the events of 9/11 and its aftermath in a form that is brutal and direct, portraying the effects of violence in a way that reflects the reality of the contemporary political moment. In general, however, the violence that defines the war on terror has unfolded mainly out of frame, generating very little in the way of rich symbolic structures or innovations in form. Rather, films and other artworks have mainly responded to the war on terror with what the political theorist Christopher Coker calls the discourses of re-enchantment. The infatuation with remote weaponry and digital intercoding in many films of the 9/11 period, post-9/11 period, what one writer calls the battle of the screens and another writer has labeled digital fatigue, might best be understood as a form of technological re-enchantment with war. With the advent of wired war and bio-war, the violence of warfare is now frequently reframed in film as technological and seductive. Blanketed in digital imagery, many contemporary war films appear to envision war as a technological, mediated experience, far removed from the trauma of embodied violence. The imposing power of the violated body in Zero Dark 30 might be seen then as a particularly resonant expression of disenchantment, a figuration that foregrounds the imagery of violence in the body in war. In Zero Dark 30, the depictions of interrogation and torture that dominate the first third of the film accentuate the dehumanizing nature of violence. Hard lighting, urine-soaked cells, plain and unaccented camera work, these scenes have an unadorned visual directness. The film pivots into more familiar genre convention, however, with the killing of Maya's CIA colleague, Jessica, a woman who has befriended Maya and whose warmth and humanity set her apart. With this devastating scene, rendered in a style of exacting suspense, violence can find its conventions. A hinge point in the narrative, the scene divides the film into two segments, as the brutal and radically disenchanting interrogations that dominate the first third give way to the genre language of the procedural, shifting away from Maya's violent apprenticeship and torture to a form that accesses the familiar conventions of popular drama. The procedural has become one of the mainstream drama genres of the contemporary period, a form that, unlike the torture scenes of the first third of the film, is familiar and amenable to the viewing public. As Steven Shaviro writes, the procedural emphasizes process and analysis in its narrative design. But more importantly, it elevates process to an overarching goal, independent of any particular end. In Zero Dark 30, Shaviro writes, is a powerful enactment of the proceduralism of contemporary social and political life. In some ways, Shaviro's reading is starkly opposite my own, where he emphasizes the draining of affect and drama into endless process and bureaucracy. I find the film invokes intensive registers of affective experience, especially in its depictions of violent infliction. Maya's encounter with violence shapes her character, driving her to prosecute bin Laden, to confront the station chief and later the CIA bureaucracy in Washington for more resources. Her single-mindedness takes on a religious zeal. I believe, here's a quote, I believe I was spared so I can finish the job, she says at one point. The power of violence in this scenario, its penetrating and contaminating symbolic potency, speaks to a sense of endless threat emanating from both sides of the equation, with the meaning and the purpose of both terrorists and counter-terrorists defined mainly by destruction. The middle third of the film, for all of its well-designed plotting of the elements of the chase and its extraordinary depiction of the surveillance network enveloping the courier, primarily functions as a transition between the film's two main dramatic engagements with violence, each of which illuminates two radically embodied experiences of war that form the crux of the film's originality and importance. Taken together, the interrogation sequences and the raid on bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad enact a powerful contemporary variant on the aesthetic responses to violence that one writer has described as disenchantment and enchantment. Where the first third of the film is radically disenchanting, the last third unfolds under the sign of enchanted violence, as the crack team of Navy SEALs moves in concert with Central Command, operating from a finely calibrated plan of attack and supported by a vast technological apparatus that converts intelligence into force. The nocturnal setting of the assault on bin Laden's compound underscores the drama of the attack, the minute-by-minute suspense of the incursion, and the aesthetic patterning of kinetic actions and carefully plotted pause points. In contrast to the harsh realism of the torture scenes, the nighttime raid provides an opportunity to explore a new, visually lush but realistic aesthetic, with the night vision goggles of the SEALs team providing images of the raid that have an unprecedented drama and directness. In some ways, the signature genre of the 21st century, the procedural is revealed here to be a new idiom for enchanted violence. Employing the vocabulary of technology and teamwork, the raison d'etre of the procedural, to reference Shabiro again, is the success of the mission. As agents of expressive, enchanted violence in the 21st century, the Special Ops Team, the Navy SEALs unit that conducts the raid on bin Laden's compound, is emblematic. Decked out in technology, reading and communicating information in a continuous stream, otherworldly in their skill and discipline, the SEALs team leaves the ordinary world of disenchanted violence, the deforming kind of violence, to one side. Instead, we see their doubled night vision goggles and sleekly armored suits, replete with an array of weapons and tools that materialize when needed. A bat suit with lethal implements. We see their instantaneous and correct decisions, and their gentleness with the women and children in the compound. We see their quick dispatch of potential threats, and we linger not over the bodies they have left behind, but over the computer hard drives that they collect from the compound. The violence of war, and to some extent the physical reality of the mission, is mitigated and transformed into art in this sequence, choreographed into something almost magical. Zero Dark 30 comes full circle, however, in its closing moments. The choreography of violence that defines the attack on bin Laden's compound has a curious after effect of diminishment, as if the violent incursion just conducted was sobering rather than exalting. The two scenes that close the film, the unzipping of the body bag and Maya's desperate, lost expression when she is asked where she would like to go, suggest an unknown future, not the germinating future of renewal or transformation, but one that simply awaits the next cycle. Paradise Now, The Hurt Locker, and Zero Dark 30 draw on the power of violence to create aesthetically striking works. Neither turning away from nor embracing violence, these films underscore the close connection between aesthetic form and the history of violence that the war film evokes and appropriates. In the three films I've discussed here, we're reminded of the power of bodies in war, and of the war film as a medium of embodied imagination. And in a period marked by collective disavowal, perhaps the somatic focus of these works can help to revivify the tragic costs of war. Thank you.